Hi, everybody. Today we are going to talk about the agents of change, also known as population genetics. And so, to review what we've learned so far, we've learned about the evidence for evolution, we've learned about natural selection, and we've learned how we can measure the alleles in a population using the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation, the P plus Q equals 1, and the P squared plus 2PQ plus Q equals 1. And now we're going to learn about how things are actually going to evolve, what things can actually cause a change or evolution in a population. So there are 5 things that can cause changes in a population. The first one is mutation. Then it's gene flow. Then it's a non-random mating. Then it's genetic drift. And then it's natural selection, right? So all of these can cause a change in a population. Now, if we were to look at populations that didn't change, populations that were not evolving, then they would not have any of these things. That means there would be no mutations. That means there would be no migration, immigration, emigration, that all mating would be random, that all populations would be large, and that there would be no natural selection. If none of these things were happening, then a population would be in what we call equilibrium, which means its allele frequencies would not be changing. So let's take a look at these things that can cause a change. The first one is mutation. Mutation is the thing that's really natural selection is dependent on. Mutation creates variation. They're constantly appearing. They change the DNA, and therefore they change the amino acid sequence most times, which changes the protein structure, it changes the protein's form, and if it changes the actual protein structure, then the function of the protein is probably going to change as well. And therefore, since we are changing proteins, we may be changing the phenotype, and therefore, if we're changing the phenotype, we may be changing the fitness of the organism. All right, mutations, a pretty clear one. Gene flow is the next one. Gene flow is the movement of individuals in or out of a population. So an example of this would be seeds or pollen that are blown by the wind or moved through being stuck on an insect or another animal. That is going to be gene flow, right? That's migration. Pollen and seeds can be moved out of a population and then they can be moved back in. All right. So subpopulations, that's different groups within one population, can have different allele frequencies due to a lack of immigration or due to immigration. Gene flow is going to cause genetic mixing across regions, and it's going to reduce the differences between populations when there is a lot of gene flow. So two different subpopulations or two different populations that have high gene flow, they're going to be more similar, and populations that do not have high gene flow, they're going to be more different. All right, in humans, because we have various subpopulations, that there is a lot of gene flow going on since travel is so easy now. We are seeing that the populations are becoming more similar over time instead of more different. All right, so here's a core question. How might gene flow between populations living in different habitats actually interfere with each population's adaptation to its local environment? Take a moment and answer this question. Well, what you might be thinking is that if you have a lot of gene flow, groups are going to become more similar. But if these different groups are in different habitats, they're going to be adapted to specialize in those habitats. So if you have a lot of mixing between two populations, let's say it's two insects, for example, that have moved between populations, then you could find yourself with reduced fitness if you are in a different habitat. So that can interfere with the population's adaptation. All right. Question 2, how would limited gene flow influence the genetics between populations? Take a moment to answer this. Well, we know that limited gene flow between two populations is going to mean that those populations are going to become more different over time. They're going to become less similar because they're not mixing as much, their genes. What effect does gene flow have on the genetic makeup of a population? Take a moment to answer this question. Well, if there is gene flow, then you are including more alleles, or you might be losing alleles if individuals are leaving your population. So that's going to have an effect on your genetic makeup, the introduction of alleles or the loss of alleles. All right. Excuse me. Then there is sexual selection. Sexual selection means that there is selection involved in mating. So organisms prefer to mate with one specific type of organism. So usually it's the females that decide in most populations who they're going to mate with. In the peacock example, male peacocks have these brightly colored feathery displays, and that is a display of fitness, right? The healthiest males can produce these very expensive, energetically expensive feather displays. So the more brilliant the display, the more energy a male has, and therefore potentially the more fit the male is. So a female is going to choose to mate with a male that has the most brilliant, brightest, best display. Now, of course, it's sort of a catch-22 because you've got this bird that has these bright, long, noticeable feathers. In order to attract a female, that also means they're going to be more attractive towards predators. So, in one way, it can lower their fitness, but the gamble is worth it because it increases their chances of mating. And the same thing is true for many of these organisms. The lion's mane is a symbol of fitness. The bright red color on this bird's chest is going to be a signal of fitness. The brighter the color, the more fit the bird, and the more likely that the females will choose this one to mate with. The antlers, so these two males are going to fight. So the biggest antlers are probably going to help win that fight. So the genes for large antler displays are going to be passed on. All right. So how can sexual selection lead to highly exaggerated traits among males? Well, in sexual selection, we know that females are going to choose the brightest or the biggest displays oftentimes. So that means that the brightest and the biggest of every generation are going to have a higher fitness and they're going to pass their genes on. So it's sort of in a way like artificial selection. We keep selecting for these incredibly bright displays. Over time, they're going to get more and more bright. All right, sexual selection is going to act in all sexually reproducing species. When there is choosing to go on, there's not usually random mating. Instead, the mating is going to be specific. Females are going to choose what they want to mate with, or males might fight over who gets to mate. Sexual dimorphism results from sexual difference between males and females. Here's a female bird of paradise, just sort of brown, and the males have this incredibly weird display they use to court females. So sexual selection can influence both the way they look, morphology, but also behavior, calling. So a bird call or frogs that are calling, that's going to be sexual selection too, because females are going to pick the best call. Sexual selection can act in opposition to natural selection. Like we see with the peacock, the peacocks are more noticeable with that incredible display. There is a female peahen, not very colorful, and producing this giant feathery display is the male's job. All right. So the lion's mane, there is some evidence that females are attracted to males with larger, darker manes, and that is going to correlate with higher testosterone levels, which is going to correlate to, in males, better nutrition and health and producing more offspring. So better sperm count, which means that it's going to be a higher fitness. So there is evidence to support the idea that sexual selection is going to increase fitness. All right. But as it says there, it imposes a cost to the male because making that mane is difficult, it's energetically expensive, and it also makes them less conspicuous when they're hunting. All right, and then we have genetic drift. Genetic drift is something that's not a selective pressure, it's actually due to a chance event. Genetic drift, there's two types. There's the founder effect and a bottleneck effect. Both of these things are a chance effect due to a small, isolated population. So we said before that large populations have less change in them over time, but small populations are much more prone to random changes. The founder effect is when a small group splinters off and starts a new colony. Here, we have some of these birds leaving the mainland and going to an island. That's going to be the founder effect. A bottleneck is going to be when some disaster is going to happen and it's going to reduce the population to a very small number. And then from that reduced number, the population will recover and expand. So let's take a look at the founder effect. When a new population is started by only a few individuals. So what's going on in this example is that there may be some rare alleles in this small population. And these rare alleles may be found at a higher frequency because the members of this small new population are going to be potentially related. So they're more likely to have the same alleles. This is going to skew the gene pool of the new population. So human populations that start from a small group of colonists. A few examples of this would be the colonization of the New World on I think it's Martha's Vineyard. The founder effect happened when it was originally colonized hundreds of years ago, and there was an increased rate of deafness. So genetically caused deafness there, that much more of the population ended up being deaf than in the normal mainland population. And that's because the people who just so happened to colonize that island ended up having these recessive genes that they didn't know were there. And as the inbreeding occurred of the colonists, that recessive allele showed up more and more often. In Amish and Mennonite communities, sometimes we see a higher frequency of six-finger dwarfism. So this disorder where they have an extra finger on one hand. And this is because many of the Amish populations, when they started, were started by people that had this rare recessive disorder. And over time, because the population is small and isolated, inbreeding happened. So you are more likely to breed with somebody who you are related to. And because everybody's related, they're more likely to have this allele. And so the allele shows up in Amish communities at a much higher rate than the normal mainland communities. So we see these strange, skews of the gene pool that you wouldn't see in a bigger community. It's because this community is small. Then there's the bottleneck effect. This is when a population is drastically reduced by a disaster. So we see an analogy here. We have a pretty diverse population. A bottleneck happens, and we see that only a few members survive. So notice we had blue and yellow beads, and then we also had red. But when the bottleneck happened, none of the red survived, right? And that's not due to any reason other than random chance. Just so happens that the red ones didn't survive. So basically, red has been taken out of the gene pool. And as this population increases again, we see that the red individuals do not appear in the next generation any longer. So famine, natural disaster, loss of habitat. We have a loss of variation due to a chance event. So alleles can be lost or severely reduced from the gene pool due to the bottleneck effect. This is not due to a lack of fitness. This is due just to random chance. Again, this is going to narrow the gene pool. Cheetahs are an example of this. All cheetahs share a small number of alleles, so they don't have much genetic diversity. And it's almost like all cheetahs are identical twins because they are so similar. So cheetahs underwent two bottlenecks 10,000 years ago, and then in the last 100 years due to poaching and a loss of habitat. So cheetahs really have a lack of diversity due to these bottlenecks. And it's one of the reasons why trying to get the cheetah population back up is so difficult, because there's not a lot of genetic diversity, which means they're more prone to genetic illness. And the bottleneck effect is a big issue with conservation biology, because many endangered species that we are now able to bring back up, we've lost diversity. Pandas, the peregrine falcon, these tamarins, they all have a loss of diversity from the bottleneck of overhunting or loss of habitat. So the reduced variation reduces the adaptability. This is also happening in Illinois. We have the Illinois prairie chicken, which lost 99% of its habitat. And then we've tried to save some of that habitat, and the prairie chicken numbers went up. But a lot of them end up being sterile or infertile because of the loss of genetic variation. So these recessive alleles are showing up in the population, which is making it harder for them to come back from their reduced numbers. All right. Why are smaller populations more affected by genetic drift? And the reason why these smaller populations are more affected by genetic drift is because those random chance alleles have a bigger impact when a population is small and isolated than they would in a huge population of thousands and thousands and thousands of people. All right, let's skip that. Okay, so genetic drift is significant in small populations. It is a change that's random. Usually it's a loss of genetic variation, not a gain. And genetic drift can cause harmful alleles to become fixed in a population. All right, and finally, we have natural selection. This is another mechanism by which evolution can occur. We already know what natural selection is, so this one should be easy. Differential survival and reproduction due to changing environmental conditions. Climate change, which has happened many times in history. Food source availability might change, new predators, different parasites, different diseases. All of these things can drive natural selection. So there's a combination of alleles that provide a fitness increase in a population. So here in the picture on the right, we see two different moths. It may be hard to see one of them. We have the white moth and the black moth down here. One of these is very good at hiding from birds, the other one not so much. Right? So if the trees change, if pollution changes, then that can change the fitness, right? One of the moths may be more or less fit when the environment changes, and that's going to change how the moth population responds. So if you look at this picture, it may be clear that the darker colored moths are going to be more fit in this particular environment, but if things change, we might have a reversal, and it might be more fit to be a lighter colored moth. That might be the more beneficial adaptation. All right, selection is going to act on any trait that affects survival or reproduction. So it can be selection due to predation, so traits that help predators, traits that help prey get away or hide. Physiological selection, traits that make something more efficient. Or also, of course, sexual selection, which is separate, and we already talked about that. So predation selection is going to act both on predators and prey. Could have to do with behavior. So here we have zebras that are in groups. So that's a behavior. It could be camouflage and mimicry. So these two butterflies, the viceroy and the monarch, are going to resemble one another, but one is actually not going to taste very good. So because one doesn't taste very good, birds avoid both of them. So that's called a mimicry, and that's another selective advantage. It could be speed. So a cheetah has evolved to be faster in order to catch its prey over time. Could be defenses, right? Like a horn. There are physical and chemical defenses. It could be thorns on a plant. It could be like poison ivy will make you itch. All of those things are to prevent being eaten or hunted. There's peppers to prevent being eaten. All right. Physiological selection is going to act on body functions. So this is giving disease resistance. Or it could be physiological efficiency using oxygen, being able to process food, saving water. These are all selective advantages that could be with animals or with plants. Biochemical versatility, protection from injury, all of these things are part of physiological selection. All right, this is an example showing how an antifreeze glycoprotein appeared in fish. So fish that live in water that is going to be very cold, they have a protein that prevents some of the fluids inside their body from freezing. So that would be a physiological adaptation. All right, so natural selection can take one of three pathways. It can be directional selection. So this is when over time it's beneficial to have one extreme versus the other. So if you notice, most of these organisms have the medium phenotype. And over time, it becomes beneficial to have a phenotype in one direction. So that's directional selection. So an example of this would be perhaps giraffe neck size, right? Most giraffes had a medium sized neck, and then over time it became beneficial for giraffes to have a longer neck. So evolution pushed giraffes in one direction. What else? We have stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is going to select for the middling phenotype. So an example of this is human birth rate. So if you think thousands and thousands of years ago, giving birth to a very large baby would have been quite dangerous because the actual act of giving birth would have been very complicated. And giving birth to a small underweight baby also would have been selected against because they would not have been able to maintain heat well. So giving birth to a middleweight baby would have been the most advantageous because it was most likely to be a successful birth. So over time, what we saw is that the range of birth weights actually went down and they became more and more in the middle because of having the two extremes selected against. And then we have disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is the opposite of stabilizing. This is when it's beneficial to have one of the two extremes or both, but not the middle. So rock pocket mice, these are mice that are a dark color or a light color to match the stones in their area, but it's not beneficial to be the medium color because the medium color happens to be what sticks out. All right, and those are the 5 agents of evolutionary change: mutation, gene flow, non-random mating, genetic drift, and natural selection. All of these are mechanisms of change that can cause evolution. All right, we are going to stop there. Let me know if you have any questions.